I wasn't supposed to be in Edinburgh that week. I want to be clear about that up front, because everything that happened, everything I saw, everything that unraveled in front of a crowd of maybe 200 strangers, it only happened because my flight got diverted. My luggage went to Oslo, and I ended up sitting on a wet stone bench outside the Palace of Holyrood House with nothing but a dead phone and a paper cup of coffee that had gone cold somewhere around the second hour of waiting. That's how you find the things that matter, I think. Not by looking, by getting lost enough that looking stops being an option. It was the third week of November. Edinburgh in November is a particular kind of cold. Not violent, not the chest punch kind you get in Moscow or Chicago, but persistent, patient. The kind of cold that works its way through your jacket in increments, so slow you don't notice until you're already frozen. The sky that morning was the color of old dishwater, flat and non-committal, and the tourists who'd gathered along the Royal Mile had the look of people who'd agreed to be somewhere and were now quietly renegotiating the terms. The palace sits at the bottom of the mile, crouched at the foot of Arthur's Seat like something that grew there rather than was built. Stone darker than you'd expect, windows that catch no light, the kind of building that keeps secrets as a matter of architecture. I'd been watching the gate rotation for about 40 minutes, not because I planned to, but because I had nothing else to do, and there is something hypnotic about the household cavalry when they stand in full dress. The red, the absurd shine of those helmets. The way they hold themselves like they've made a private agreement with gravity. The guard that morning was young. I noticed that before I noticed anything else. Young in the way that reads like an accusation, like his face hadn't yet agreed to be what the uniform was asking it to be. Maybe 23, maybe younger. Jaw that looked carved but hadn't settled into itself yet. Eyes that moved, which is the thing about palace guards people don't expect. They move, they take everything in, they just don't react to it. His nameplate, and I only learned this later, from a woman who'd been standing closer, read Alderton. There was a group of men near the gate. I noticed them the way you notice weather, peripherally, before the information becomes specific. 6 of them, clustered in that particular formation of people who know each other in a context where violence is at least theoretically on the table. Not tourists, wrong shoes for tourists, wrong posture. They had the practiced casualness of people who've decided to make a point and are working out the choreography. What happened next lasted maybe 4 minutes. It felt like an hour. The man at the front of the group was the one who moved first. Late 40s, built wide, not tall, in the way that speaks to decades of deliberate effort. Silver at his temples in a way that looked, and this is the only word, curated. He was wearing a coat that cost more than my rent, and he carried himself with the bone-deep assurance of someone who has never once stood in a line. Later, I would learn his name was Rupert Alderton Vane. I would learn it because the story found its way onto 3 separate news sites by midnight, and because the name Alderton Vane means something in certain rooms in this country that it means nothing in others. He was, it emerged, the current Duke of something I couldn't pronounce. Second, in a peerage line that stretched back to a land grant in 1683. He had a seat in the Lords. He had 4 properties. He had the particular confidence of a man who has been told his entire life that the world will arrange itself around his presence if he simply waits long enough. He walked toward the gate like he owned the cobblestones. I watched the guard, Alderton, that young soldier with the unsettled jaw, clock him from 30 feet out. Something happened in the guard's posture then, not fear, not recognition exactly, something more interior than either. He straightened, which shouldn't have been possible because he was already standing at what I'd assumed was the outer boundary of upright. But there's a straightening that's about posture, and there's a straightening that's about the spine, making a decision. This was the second kind. The man in the expensive coat stopped 3 feet from the gate. He said something. I was too far to hear the words, but I could hear the register, that particular upper-class English tone that phrases every sentence as though the listener should feel grateful to be addressed. The woman next to me, Scottish accent, 60s, thermos of tea, absolutely not there for any nonsense, muttered something I didn't catch. The guard didn't move, the man said something else. Louder this time, a gesture toward the gate with one hand, the kind of gesture that says open it the way a snapping finger says fetch. The guard didn't move. I want you to understand what didn't move means here because it's doing a lot of work. It wasn't passive, it wasn't absence, it was the most active possible stillness, the kind of stillness that costs something to maintain. The kind that is, in the technical sense, a refusal. The woman with the thermos said, clearly this time, "Oh, this should be something. Here's what I pieced together later from the news coverage and from a man named Stuart who'd been standing near the front of the crowd and had good ears and no qualms about sharing what he'd overheard." The Duke, and I'll call him the Duke because that's what he considered relevant, had arrived that morning with a piece of paper. A document, technically, a letter drafted on what Stuart described as stiff cream paper that probably cost £1 a sheet, bearing a seal that he'd presented to the guard with the energy of someone producing a winning hand in a card game. The letter, apparently, was from someone with enough institutional weight to make the request theoretically navigable. Access to the private apartments, a meeting with the household staff, something to do with a ceremonial position that was, the Duke believed, his by hereditary right, a position that had been 2 days prior formally declined, not by staff, not by an aide, not by any of the bureaucratic buffer layers that exist precisely so that certain things never have to be said directly by the people who mean them, declined by the person who held the authority to accept it. And here was the Duke on a cold November morning with his cream paper and his inherited consequence, presenting himself at the gate as though the declining had been a miscommunication, a clerical error, something that the physical act of showing up would correct. The guard knew all of this. That was the thing, he knew. Not because someone had briefed him, or not only because someone had briefed him, but because the guard's full name, which the news coverage buried in the 14th paragraph, was James Alderton. And James Alderton was the man whose position had been declined on his behalf. I didn't know any of that yet, standing there with my cold coffee and my confiscated luggage somewhere over Scandinavia. What I knew was that something was happening that the crowd around me was beginning to collectively sense. The way a room senses a shift in air pressure before the storm's visible. People were lowering their phones from the automatic tourist photo position. People were leaning forward. The Scottish woman with the thermos had gone entirely still. The Duke held out the letter again. The guard looked at it, not at him, at it, with the controlled attention of someone who has been trained to make no movement that isn't chosen. Then he looked back up, and he said loudly enough that the front rows of the crowd could hear, and clearly enough that Stuart could relay it word for word later. He said, "I'm not able to assist you with that, sir." 11 words, 11. The Duke's face did something complicated, something that started in the jaw and moved outward, slow and ugly, like ink dropped into still water. "Do you know," he said, "who I am?" And the guard, James Alderton, 23 years old, jaw that hadn't settled yet, eyes that moved and absorbed and chose their reactions, said nothing, which was, I realized watching it happen in real time, its own kind of answer. The thermos woman exhaled, a sound somewhere between a laugh and something that precedes tears. The Duke took a step forward, and the guard took a step, too, not back, not sideways, but forward to match him, weight redistributed, posture shifting from formal stillness into something older and more animal. A step that said, "This is exactly as far as you go." The two of them stood there, 3 feet apart, two men, same name, different centuries. The crowd held its breath in the particular way that crowds hold breath, badly, visibly. Everyone pretending they're not leaning 3 inches further in the direction of the thing they cannot look away from. And then the Duke, silver-templed, coat-draped, paper-clutching, turned. He walked back the way he'd come, and his posture as he went was the most complex thing I saw all day. The rigid, overcorrected spine of someone who refuses to let you see what you've just done to him. The guard returned to position, and I mean he returned not gradually, not in stages, but in one clean movement, like a switch thrown. The young face settled back into its ceremonial blankness. The posture resumed its formal geometry, but... And this is the part I keep turning over, weeks later, in whatever city I've ended up in. For 3 seconds before the switch was thrown, before the face arranged itself back into the official version, he looked tired. Not physically, not the bone-deep tired of a long shift. The other kind, the kind that doesn't go away with sleep. 3 seconds. Then it was gone. The Scottish woman capped her thermos. "Good lad," she said, to nobody in particular. She meant it the way you mean something when you're talking about endurance rather than victory. I stayed another hour. I'm not sure why. The cold had gone from patient to personal by then, properly inside my jacket, having its way with my shoulders. But I kept watching him. Alderton James. The way he held the position through 2 more rotation checks. The way his eyes moved, swept the perimeter, catalogued each face, moved on, without ever landing on anything for too long. The way he breathed, which you could see if you watched his shoulders, slow and very deliberate in the cold air. I thought about the letter, the cream paper, the seal. I thought about what it means to be offered something. A title, a position, a seat at a table your blood has occupied for 300 years, and to say no. Not in a letter, not through intermediaries, but to say it with your body, with your posture, with 11 words and 1 step forward and 3 seconds of visible exhaustion that you then pack away and present to no one. There is a kind of refusal that is also a preservation. He'd been offered, from what I later understood, a ceremonial role in the household. Junior, but symbolic. The kind of thing that, accepted, would have begun a particular kind of story. The kind with portraits and sittings and a name on a door and the long, slow dissolution of everything you were before the name on the door. He'd said no. His father, the Duke, the silver temples, the cream paper had come to correct this error. And James Alderton had corrected the correction. In 11 words and 1 step and 3 seconds that cost him something I have no name for, a woman approached me as I was finally leaving, mid-30s. Camera bag had the look of someone who documents things professionally. "You saw the whole thing?" she asked. "From the bench," I said. She nodded, looked back at the gate, where Alderton was still standing, still moving his eyes, still breathing slow in the visible Edinburgh air. "Do you know what the worst part is?" she said. I didn't. "He'll stand there for another 4 hours," she said. "Same spot, same position. And the whole time, he'll be the only one who knows exactly what he just gave up." She walked away before I could say anything, which was fine. She'd said the thing. The cold came back. I finished my coffee, which had moved past cold into something approaching ambient temperature, and I left. Behind me, barely audible over the wind coming down from Arthur's Seat, the city went on being itself. Tour buses and cobblestones and someone selling something from a cart. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, a young man stood perfectly still and kept his eyes moving and breathed the deliberate breath of someone who has made a choice they intend to keep. Every 4 seconds. Regular as a clock? I counted until I was too far away to count anymore. My grandmother used to say that rivers remember everything thrown into them. She meant it the way old women in river towns mean things, not as metaphor, but as fact, as something the water had simply demonstrated to her over 60 years of living beside it. Rings letters. A watch that had belonged to a man who didn't deserve a funeral. The river took things and it didn't forget them. It just relocated them, somewhere downstream, somewhere you weren't. I thought about that the morning I drove to Twickenham, October. Still enough warmth in the air to feel like a threat, like summer wasn't gone so much as waiting, collecting evidence. The Thames at Richmond runs wide and flat and self-possessed, the kind of river that looks like it made a decision early on about its own dignity. Swans, old bridges, the particular greenish light that happens when sun hits water through October trees. I was there for a story that wasn't a story yet. My editor had sent me a name, a single name, no context, no file, attached to an address in Hampton, and a 2-line note that said, "Someone has done something. Find out what." My editor communicates like a man who's been charged by the syllable his entire career. The name was Casimir Brandt Orlov. I found the address on my second pass down the lane. A tall, narrow house with a walled garden, set back from the road far enough to make a statement about who gets to knock on its door. Old brick, the color of dried blood, which sounds ominous, and probably isn't, but nonetheless. A linden tree in the front garden that had gone mostly gold by then, dropping leaves with the resigned efficiency of something shedding what it no longer needed. A man answered the door before I knocked. He'd clearly heard the gate, tall, late 30s, maybe 40. The kind of face that in different light would read differently in morning light, angular and unsmiling, in the light from the hallway which fell on him sideways as he pulled the door open. Something else, something that had been through several versions of itself and hadn't finished. He was holding a mug of something. He looked at me, the way people look at things they've decided not to be surprised by. Journalist, he said. Does it show? The shoes, he said. Nobody who grew up with money wears shoes like that. I looked down. He wasn't wrong. Casimir Brandt Orlov, I said. Kaz, he said. Casimir is what my mother calls me when she's about to explain something I already know. He stepped back from the door. Come in. I've been expecting someone. The inside of the house was the first honest surprise of the day. I'd expected, and I'll admit this is a failure of imagination on my part, I'd expected the inside to match the outside in a particular way. The kind of interior that whispers about itself, the kind that has been assembled rather than lived in. It hadn't been assembled. It had been lived in, visibly and without apology. Books on every available surface in the category of real books, which is to say books that had been read, broken-spined and underlined and left open face down in the way that very tidy people consider a violation. Paintings, but not the ancestral portrait kind, the kind you buy because you can't stop thinking about them. A kitchen table with 6 chairs, none of which matched, all of which showed evidence of use. A dog, elderly, who raised his head when I entered, decided I was acceptable and lowered it again. No portraits, that was the thing I noticed, working backward later. In a house connected by blood and by legal record to one of the older German-Russian dynastic lineages in European historical memory. No portraits, not even photographs of the formal variety. A bulletin board in the hallway with concert tickets and a child's drawing of what might have been a horse and a takeaway menu for a Thai place in Richmond. He saw me looking. The portraits are in storage, he said. They were making me feel watched. We sat at the kitchen table with coffee he made properly, which I mention because it is one of the ways people reveal themselves, the degree of attention they bring to making coffee for a stranger, and he talked in the unhurried way of a man who has made a decision and is now comfortable in the aftermath of it. The decision, which I'd been briefed on in the car by 3 different search results from 3 different European publications, was this. 6 weeks prior, Casimir Brandt Orlov, the last living direct male heir of the Brandt Orlov line, which had held a morganatic claim to a Rhenish title for 4 generations, had formally, legally, and in writing renounced that claim, not in a press release. In a letter to a registry office in Cologne. 3 paragraphs. In German, which was his 3rd language, witnessed by his solicitor and a neighbor named, apparently, Patricia. The European tabloids had found out 5 weeks later, the British papers another week after that. By the time I sat at his kitchen table, the thing had developed a particular kind of noise, the kind that happens when the people who care about dynastic succession, which is a specific and committed population, find out that someone has chosen not to. The phone rang a lot, he said, turning his mug in both hands. For the first 2 weeks, the phone rang constantly. Who called? The family, he said. My cousins? My mother's sister? She's based in Vienna. She called 4 times in one afternoon. A man I don't know in Frankfurt who seemed to feel it was his business. And he shrugged, the shrug of someone who has considered the question carefully and found it, in the end, smaller than expected. I let it ring, he said. Here's what I understood by the time the 2nd cup of coffee appeared on the table. Casimir Brandt Orlov had grown up aware of the claim in the way that children of a certain class grow up aware of things, not as something you talk about directly, but as a presence in the room. Something the adults looked at and you weren't supposed to look at, and so you looked at it all the time. His father had died when he was 11, his mother French, practical in the specifically French way of keeping practicality and feeling entirely separate, had moved them to London the following year. She had not discouraged the claim, she had also not encouraged it. She had, Casimir said, treated it like a piece of furniture that nobody wanted to move but nobody particularly sat on. He went to school. He went to university in Edinburgh. He taught himself to cook. He fell in love with someone who turned out to be wrong for him in all the interesting ways. He learned to fix engines in a summer he doesn't talk about. And all of it, the school, the university, the Edinburgh years, the wrong person, the engines, all of it happened alongside the claim, which sat there, dormant and waiting, like a question he hadn't answered yet. It wasn't the title itself, he said, and I could tell from the way he said it that this was a sentence he'd been refining for weeks. It's not that I think titles are absurd. Some people find them meaningful. I'm not interested in arguing about that. What was it then? He looked at the table for a moment, then at the window where the linden tree in the garden was dropping gold into the October air. There's a version of yourself, he said, that they need you to become. If you accept, and it starts small, it always starts small the way they describe it. Ceremonial, symbolic. Nobody's asking you to do anything you wouldn't normally do. He picked up the mug. But I know what happens to the things I normally do once a symbol requires them. I know how a room fills up. I know what a photograph at the right moment costs you. Not in money, he paused. I know what you start saying in interviews about things you privately believe differently. Because the symbol requires a position, and the position requires consistency. And consistency requires that you stop allowing yourself to be uncertain about anything, because uncertain symbols are useless. He looked at me. I like being uncertain, he said. I've earned it. There was a moment about 40 minutes in that I keep coming back to. He'd gotten up to let the dog out into the garden, the elderly dog, who moved like a question about ambition, and I sat at the table and looked at the bulletin board in the hallway. The concert tickets, the child's drawing, the Thai takeaway menu. There was a photograph pinned at the corner that I hadn't noticed before. Two men in a field somewhere. Summer, long grass, the aggressive green of English July. Casimir and someone older, an arm around a shoulder, both of them squinting into the sun with the specific squint of people who'd rather be where they are than anywhere else. I didn't ask about it. He came back with the dog and saw me looking. My father, he said, 6 months before. He sat down. I didn't ask the question that would have followed, because you don't, and because he answered it anyway. He wanted me to take it, Cass said. The claim. He thought it mattered. He thought it was. He turned the mug again. He thought it was the thing he was leaving me, and he wanted to make sure I understood what it was before he left. Quiet. Did you tell him? I asked. I told him I'd think about it, he said. Which was true. I'd been thinking about it for 28 years. The news coverage, as I mentioned, found the story through European publications first. The angle they took, predictably, was the angle of absence, the heir who turned his back. The renunciation, the family's response, which was delivered through a spokesperson and was, by any measure, beautifully aggrieved. They missed the thing, which is often how it goes with stories about people who give things up. The coverage dwells on what was refused, which is visible and legible and has a press release. The thing that was preserved, the private, particular, hard-won thing that the refusal protected, that doesn't make the lead. It's harder to photograph. I stayed until the light shifted. The October afternoon doing what October afternoons do in England, collapsing from gold into something more honest. He walked me to the gate. The linden tree dropped a leaf between us, which sounds constructed but wasn't. Can I ask? I said, what you did with the letter after you sent it. He looked genuinely surprised by the question, in the way that suggests it was the right one. Nothing, he said. I went for a run along the river, and I watched the swans for a while, he said. And then I came home and made soup. He said it the way my grandmother used to state things the river had taught her, not as metaphor, as fact, as something simply demonstrated. Soup, I said. Lentil, he said. With a lot of thyme. He went back inside. The gate clicked shut. I stood in the lane for a moment, the October light doing something complicated to the river further down. And I thought about my grandmother's river and the things it remembered and the things it just relocated, gently, downstream, somewhere you weren't. Then I drove back to London.